Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with The Spectator Bird by Wallace Stegner. This book was originally published back in 1976, and I read it picked up a National Book Award for Fiction that year. So yeah, The Spectator Bird by Wallace Stegner. I'm not sure how this book got on my reading list, but it was there, and I was sort of browsing books, just sort of choosing my next book, and off my list, and this one caught my eye, and I thought, well, let me read this one, and it turned out to be really interesting and really sort of and funny in certain ways. But what it's about is it's really this meditation on aging, which doesn't sound funny, right? But really, because of the main character, Joe Alston, is in retirement. He's a retired literary agent, and he's kind of got this sort of dry sense of humor. He lives with his wife, Ruth, in retirement. He had been a very successful literary agent, and their life now is quite different from what it was, during his working years. And so he receives a postcard. Joe receives a postcard from an old friend from Denmark. So about 20 plus years in the past, Joe and Ruth had taken this trip to Denmark really for two reasons. One was their son Curtis. They had one son who was an adult who had died in an accident, and so they went away after that for a period of time. It seems like it was a couple of months. And they also, Joe's mother was an immigrant from Denmark, and so he didn't know anything about where she had come from or anything like that, other than the name of the village. So they went to Denmark for really those two reasons, because of Joe's mom, and also just to get away for a while after the death of their son, Curtis. So while they're in Denmark, they end up renting rooms with this woman who it turns out is a countess, and her name is Astrid. And over time, they become friendly with her, and they start to find out, things about her. And as it turns out, there's quite a bit of mystery surrounding Astrid. She's from this aristocratic family in Denmark who are still there, but somehow she's now impoverished, and they're not helping her for whatever reason. We don't really know. And then we know she's been married in the past. And then at one point, they go out to an opera, and she's kind of shunned by people. And it's noticeable to Joe and Ruth that the people there are sort of purposefully glancing their way and ignoring Astrid. So there's a mystery there that we end up then uncovering throughout the book. And we do this by Joe reading his diary. So once he gets the postcard, it prompts him to start reading. He had kept diaries. His wife Ruth did not know he had kept these diaries. But he decides to start reading the diaries, and in the evenings, then he starts reading. Ruth wants to hear the diary as well, so he starts reading the diary to her. And so it's through that way that we then go into the past with him through the reading of this diary, and to these events of 20 some odd years in the past. And the story of Astrid really then unfolds, and the impact of sort of the relationship that develops between the three of them while they're in Denmark. So Joe and his son, I mentioned Joe's son had passed away some 20 some odd years prior to the present day of the book. And they had not had a good relationship. So they had a very, I think, common father-son kind of dynamic, where the son didn't know what he wanted to do, and the father's trying to push him into working and trying to find a profession and things like that. And Joe and Curtis, the son, didn't really want to do that. He didn't know what he wanted to do. And so they had, I guess, argued a lot and had not really seen eye to eye. And then when Curtis died, of course, that left a lot of things undone and a lot of things unsaid with that relationship. So that's not explored too much in the book, but it is touched upon off and on, because of course it impacts really their life. And what's going on here is that they're aging, and as they're aging, they're looking back on their life, and they're seeing, like, Joe is like looking at, you see that things could have been different in some way, but they weren't, and they aren't, and they're not going to be at this point. So this look back and forth in life, though. So the way that this is done in the book, where we're in the past with the diary, and then we're in the present, in their present day sort of retirement, I think really sort of contributes to this sort of meditation on aging. There's another instance in the book that I thought was really interesting when one of their friends. So like I said, Joe was a successful literary agent, so he has known a lot of famous writers and things, and there's a famous writer that's in their area that wants to visit them, and so they plan this luncheon at their house. And I think the author was a bit disappointed, because he's used to events and book events and things like that, and they're having this really quiet sort of luncheon with just them. There's no dinner, there's no other people invited to have conversation with and things like that. So it sort of illustrates the difference in their life now versus what it was in the past. There's a quote about aging that I thought was kind of funny in a way, and that is, Joe is talking about aging as far as from books. You see characters in books, and the wisdom of the ages explain how to age and how to age properly, age well, and things like that. But at one point, Joe says, crucifixion can be discussed philosophically until they start driving the nails. So, when it's on you, when it's coming up, when it's imminent for you, it's different than the abstraction of a discussion about it, if that makes sense. Another instance is, their friends in the present anyway, is their friends, when their friends are sort of dying off. And I think this is also an aspect of aging. I remember going through this with my father when I remember one time one of his friends had passed away, and they had all worked together at a certain business. And my dad said, I'm the only one left alive that worked during that time at that business. And so this is part of aging, when those around you and those you've shared your life with start to disappear. And Joe says, getting old is like standing in a long, slow line. You wake up out of the shuffle and torpor only at those moments when the line moves you one step closer to the window. Yeah, again, when it's your turn, as you're moving closer then to that edge, you see back further. Your past expands way further than your future, if that makes sense. And that meditation, I think, is really well drawn in this book. So I haven't gone into too much details about what happened in Denmark, and that's because I don't really want to give that away, because it was kind of a mystery. But, the past and how that relates to the future, and then coming to terms with that, and then deciding, if you made the best decisions or not, or if the decisions you make are the decisions that you make. And then when you're older, you have fewer of those to come, and you have more of those that have already happened. And I think in this book, Joe needs to look back at this time in Denmark, and then he really, I feel like he sort of comes to terms with, how his life has turned out. But there's a quote here that I think kind of illustrates aging again that I thought was really pretty cool, that I'll close this chat on. And the quote says, I was reminded of a remark of Willa Cather's, that you can't paint sunlight. You can only paint what it does with shadows on a wall. If you examine a life as Socrates has been so tediously advising us to do for so many centuries, do you really examine the life, or do you examine the shadows it casts on other lives, entity or relationship? I just love that sort of that imagery of you can't really paint sunlight. So a life is also sort of like sunlight that it's hard to really, I think, see in its fullness. And then this sort of question about is it you, or is it the impact that you've had in the world, or the impact that you've had with others? And this, I think, at the end of the day, the book sort of resolves around this concept of his and Ruth's, his long-term wife's relationship that they've had for many, many, many years, and that sort of bond, and how really beautiful and precious that was. And he comes to realize that. I feel like he comes to realize that there at the close of the book. All right, I will leave the chat with that. I did enjoy this meditation on aging. It was actually funnier than I've probably let on, because the character Joe sort of has a quippy kind of a narration style, and it's quite humorous in many places. But it's also a very serious topic as well: aging, coming to terms with the past, and etc. All right. I will leave the chat there. My next chat is going to be, let me just call up the cover. It is going to be some hardboiled detective fiction from 1929 by Dashiell Hammett, The Dain Curse. And I have already finished this, so I will have a chat on it coming up soon. Until next time, take care.